back to Talk Jamaica here on Talk Jamaica Radio. We are streaming live on www.talkjamaicaradio.com. I am Ralston Chamberlain.
Good afternoon, Ralston, again, and good afternoon to our listeners. My name, of course, is Ricardo Brooks, and it's now time for part 2 of our discussion segment. Many persons, if not all, have heard of the Israeli-Gaza conflict. It's been going on for a long time, and there's a lot of animosity on both sides. But many of us find ourselves less clear on the hows and the whys of the conflict. For example, why did Israel begin invading the Palestinian territory of Gaza on Thursday, July 17, 2014? And after 10 days of airstrikes that killed at least 235 Palestinians, many of them civilians, but still failing to stop Palestinian militants from showering Israeli cities with rockets. Why is the militant Palestinian group Hamas continuously firing rockets into civilian neighborhoods in Israel? How did this latest round of violence start in the first place? And why do they hate one another at all? With us, with our guests, we'll attempt to provide basic answers to most of these questions and get a sense of this conflict and the situation currently unfolding on the ground. To tell us more, online historian and Middle East policy expert, Professor Daniel Mandel. He is a professor at Melbourne University in Australia. Also online, Independent Palestinian-based journalist Yousef Al-Helou. I hope I pronounced that right. Good afternoon, gentlemen, and welcome to Talk Jamaica Radio.
Thank you very much.
All right, Professor, I'd like to start with you. Can you give us, myself, Ralston, and our listeners, a background to this Israeli-Gaza conflict?
Well, put it in a few words, quite simply, you have a territory, Gaza, which was evacuated by the Israelis in 2005 in its entirety and handed over to what was then Palestinian Authority control. Palestinian Authority is under control of Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah party, which he heads. The territory, however, did fall into the hands of Hamas in 2007 after a brief but bloody fight with Fatah, with whom, however, there was recently a reconciliation agreement amounting to a unity government. The problem, of course, of all this is, well, there's a number of layers to the issue. The Palestinian Authority came into being as a result of the Oslo peace process, which, as we all know, came about in 1993 with that famous triple handshake on the White House lawn between Bill Clinton, Yitzhak Rabin, and Yasser Arafat. It was a busted flush, a doomed business, because the central assumption in it, namely that Israelis and Palestinians would recognize each other's national aspirations and conclude a peace. In other words, saying, yes, there's movements here, there's two peace societies, and we're going to have two states, and therefore the task is to set a boundary, was baseless. The Palestinian movement has not accepted the permanence and legitimacy of a Jewish state. And therefore it is not a question of the size of Israel, it is not a question of the boundaries or any other bill of particulars. It's a question of Israel's existence. We saw this, in the failure of the initial Oslo process, which careered into bloodshed in the year 2000, when Bill Clinton, having laid out parameters, which would have meant, by the way, that you could have had today a Palestinian state in virtually all of the West Bank and Gaza, including in East Jerusalem, would have been around now for 14 years. You've had continual conflict. Yasser Arafat walked away from that, refused making a counteroffer, and launched a terrorist wave against Israel, which we later discovered was not only a matter of Hamas and other jihadist groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad carrying out the suicide bombings, but also the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is part of the Fatah movement, which actually runs the Palestinian Authority. Now, when we come to Hamas and Gaza today, the problem is quite simple. Hamas not only doesn't recognize the legitimacy of Israel, doesn't accept a Jewish state, has said repeatedly in all its official and unofficial statements that it will not accept a Jewish state ever, but you also have essentially a genocidal movement. It calls in Article 7 of its charter for the worldwide murder of the Jewish people. It cites the Quran in this, and it also cites, incidentally, the Tsarist anti-Semitic tract, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So it believes implicitly in the idea that jihad is the way to rid the world of the Jews, and particularly of the collective Jew, the state of Israel. what made this conflict come about now is harder to diagnose. It appears to be, to some extent, the product of certain mischances, as we all know. Members of Hamas kidnapped and murdered 3 Israeli teenagers a number of weeks ago. There was then a revenge attack by an extremist underground group of Jews who seized an Arab boy and murdered him in the most appalling way. Then we had Hamas launching rockets into Israel. Initially this was about rockets, like the last few conflicts. A barrage of rockets into Israel, sending, a third, half of the Israeli population continually to seek shelter in civilian air raid shelters and bunkers and so on. And the Israelis eventually decided we have to do something about this. We can't just intercept the missiles, we have to stop them being launched. That can be done from the air, but something new came into the equation this time that required a ground assault. Quite possibly, Hamas didn't realize what it was doing by launching this attack, but the attack developed in such a way that they divulged the fact that since the last ceasefire in 2012, they've been constructing literally a multi-billion-dollar collection of deep, highly sophisticated underground tunnels built of steel and concrete. And if you ask where the steel and concrete came from, that's very easy to answer. The last ceasefire in 2012 was a victory for Hamas, in a sense. The reason was because the Obama administration and others pressured Israel to accept terms which would result in Gaza being able to import steel and concrete in large amounts. Qatar, we later discovered, the state of Qatar, which is a big supporter of Hamas, and which is behind the attempts to have a favorable ceasefire, in Hamas's favor, that is to say, has given us something like $500 million to Hamas, and something like $1.2 billion in total has been spent not on building hospitals, not on building schools or shopping malls or office towers or desalination plants or anything like that, but building a network of tunnels deep into Israeli territory with what we now understand would have meant a mass casualty series of attacks, Mumbai-like, on the Jewish New Year, which comes in about a month's time. The casualties projected would have been in the hundreds, if not in the thousands, possibly more than all the Israelis who died in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was 2,500. Israel obviously is not prepared to live with the situation in which the tunnels are still in existence, so it is engaged in the arduous task on the ground of eliminating these tunnels, and that is why we are where we are now. Hamas doesn't want a ceasefire which isn't favorable to it, i.e., it will loosen still further the legitimate blockade of its territory and allowing war material to come in. And the Israelis, because they're not prepared to live in a situation where the guns stop firing and these tunnels still exist and are undetected.
But I want to bring Yousef in. Yousef, you have been on the ground, or you're on the ground. If you could paint for us and our listeners a picture of what really is taking place there inside the Gaza.
Thank you very much. The root of the conflict started in 1948 when Israel came to existence on the expense of the Palestinians. At that time was inhabited with its indigenous population, and Zionist gangs at that time, when they migrated to Palestine, wiped out about 500 towns and villages and kicked out the indigenous population of Palestine out, and making the indigenous population of Palestine refugees is scattered all over the world. I myself, a descendant of a refugee, my grandfather's hometown is located not far from Sderot, the settlement that actually saw the confrontation in the past years. So these refugees are scattered all over the world. They are not allowed to return to their ancestors' towns and villages. And one of the key problems is the right to return, which is a sacred right guaranteed under international law. Now, the PLO has recognized Israel's right to exist. And we've seen over the past 20 years, peace talks have failed so far. Obviously, Israel continues with its settlement expansion, building the apartheid wall around the West Bank, still maintains full control of Gaza's airspace, territorial waters, and border crossings. Israel claims that it has withdrew its forces and Jewish settlers from Gaza in September 2005. This is not the case. Israel has transformed Gaza into the world's largest open-air prison. And let's be frank here. I'm an independent person. I'm not affiliated to any political party. I'm as in the capacity of a person who lives in Gaza, as a journalist, freelance journalist. Hamas was democratically elected in the 2006 parliamentary elections. The world was not happy from the results of the elections and decided to impose sanctions on the Gaza Strip and Israel classified Gaza as a hostile entity, imposed a siege, shut down 4 commercial crossings. Sadly, Egypt was complicit in this and decided to aid Israel by keeping the Rafah border crossing closed. Now, what is happening in Gaza is a form of collective punishment. Nearly 2 million people live in Gaza, which is the most densely populated area in the planet. And we, as a matter of fact, more than half of the population in Gaza are children. Israel has been imposing the naval blockade since 1967. This means that Gaza has no seaport. Gaza's seaport is the only seaport on the Mediterranean that has been closed for shipping since 1967, the year when Israel occupied Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And also over the past 7 years, Israel has imposed the so-called buffer zone, which is a no-go zone, prohibiting Palestinian farmers in Gaza from reaching their land. This means about 35% of Gaza's arable land is actually is blocked. So these farmers cannot reach their land. So I would like also to stress the fact that not all people in Gaza support Hamas. This is a fact. And unfortunately, the international community, the whole world, assuming that people in Gaza support Hamas. Yes, I myself do not support Hamas, but why I am being collectively punished under Israel's, strict measures. People in Gaza cannot export, cannot import. We cannot move freely from Gaza to the West Bank. Christians in Gaza also, they cannot move freely to reach holy place in Bethlehem. Muslims in Gaza, they cannot reach Al-Aqsa Mosque to pray in Jerusalem, Al-Quds. So, this conflict has been going on, obviously, because it has something to do with Israel's military occupation. And Israel has been using Gaza as an experimental field, as a testing ground for its weapons. We know that the U.S. administration supports Israel militarily, financially, and Israel has been using American F-16s, Apache helicopters, tanks, etc., attacking defenseless population in Gaza. As I said, Hamas's popularity was really low before this onslaught or this offensive. But what Israel is doing now, is increasing the popularity of Hamas, obviously because people in Gaza are united behind the resistance. And it's simple. It's because Israel attacks civilian areas, killing over killing children while playing on the beach. And how do you expect people to revolt against the resistance when you are actually killing them, when you are destroying their property, when you are collectively punishing them and refusing to lift the siege? So,
if I might ask, I'm sorry, sir, but I just like to get Professor Mandel's take on that, because, Prof, we've heard these arguments that the Israeli soldiers are indiscriminately murdering civilians, and I've heard the term a modern-day apartheid being used to describe what is taking place.
I'll be happy to introduce some facts into it, because you're going to need some if you want to understand as well as decode what you just heard. Look, firstly, I heard some arrant nonsense, a blockade of Gaza since 1967. But Gaza was actually under Israeli control from 1967 until 2005. I can't imagine why the Israelis would be imposing a blockade on their own administration. But putting, fatuities like that aside, look, there is a war. There's no collective punishment. There's a war. In a war, collectively, everyone suffers. Let's not look necessarily, by the way, at casualties as being the guide to matters. Look, in World War... Let me give you a simple point. World War II, the British lost in World War II 357,000 dead, including about 100,000 civilians due to German bombing. The German losses were 7.5 million, including about 5 million in the last 6 months of the war. That didn't put Winston Churchill in the wrong and Adolf Hitler in the right. You have to look at the causes of the war. There's a very simple thing to be said on this. If Hamas would put down its weapons, there would be no war. If Israel put down its weapons, there would be a massacre in Israel conducted by Hamas. It's as simple as that. There seems to be a theory here that because the Israelis aren't suffering high casualties, that they're somehow in the wrong. The reason Israel is not suffering high casualties is manifold. One, they've built, because they care about their own people, unlike Hamas, they've built an extensive network at billions of dollars of cost over the years of bomb shelters for people. Everyone can reach a bomb shelter in Israel within a very short period of time. Two, they have the Iron Dome, which is able to knock out a very high percentage of the incoming missiles. They can even track the trajectory, with the result that they can normally determine when they even need to fire one. And put on the other side the fact that you have Hamas not investing in infrastructure, not improving the lot of the people. By the way, I heard Gaza described as the most densely populated place on earth. You realize that is nonsense as well. Every major city on earth is more densely populated than Gaza. Many other countries are more densely populated than Gaza. Countries that are not necessarily, in our collective imagination, crowded. Monaco is a much more heavily populated per square mile or per square kilometer than Gaza. Macau is 4 times more densely populated than Gaza. Don't fall for this nonsense that you have a huge open-air prison. You have a territory that could be the Singapore of the Middle East, but it isn't. It's run by Hamas, which wants to murder every Jew in the world, that is determined not to recognize Israel, so you don't have a basis for a peace settlement. After all, you can't have a peace settlement if one side is determined on the elimination of the other. And may I just say one other point maybe here. I hear about Palestinians unable to reach mosques in Jerusalem and so on. I'd like to know how many Christians remain in Gaza and how many of those can attend their churches. The Christians of Gaza, no one hears about this, have essentially been driven out. Their churches and the monastery in Khan Younis were torched. Their people were attacked. Almost all of them have left. One has to say, give me a break when I hear this.
Professor?
Well, the thing is, this is comment on some points. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Go ahead, Yousef. Go ahead.
Well, as I said from the very beginning, I'm not defending the position of Hamas. I am an independent person. I've got a family.
Sure we're all very grateful for that.
I've lost 12 members of my extended family. My house was targeted, like the rest of the population. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. And let's just be clear. Gaza and the West Bank should be one territorial unit under also a course of 1993. And the reason why Gaza is described as the world's largest open-air prison, simply because Israel does not actually prohibit Palestinians from Gaza to move to the West Bank and vice versa. That's why you have 2 million people crowded in Gaza. They are not allowed to move freely to the West Bank. And Israel has been...
well, look, when Hamas says it's not in a state of war and doesn't attack Israel, you'll be able to have movement, as indeed there was before this happened.
Okay. Now,
if you're upset about the damage in Gaza, why aren't you angry with Hamas? They're the ones committing the war crime of firing their missiles from hospitals, keeping ammunition dumps beneath mosques, keeping houses filled with families, asking people to become voluntary human shields, because they're basically not interested in their own civilian lives, let alone, of course, the Israeli civilians. And that is why people in Gaza are
Professor
suffering.
Professor Mandel,
if your outrage was genuine, you would surely be worried about, you would be angry with Hamas for doing this. This wouldn't be happening without their agency. But you're angry with the Israelis for responding to being attacked.
I want to understand this. Can we conflate the actions of the Hamas government with the civilians?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow the question. Can we conflate the action to it? I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, because I basically hear you saying that, look, Hamas is in a state of war, they're trying to exterminate all Jews, and if they would stop, then Palestinian civilians, like Yousef, who has clearly said he doesn't support Hamas,
yes,
would be free. But how do you say then, they're just, by the way, a casualty of war, when they,
well, it's not by the way. It's
the
inescapable tragedy of war that civilians suffer when governments go to war, particularly under particular circumstances. Hamas fights a double war crime. It targets Israeli civilians indiscriminately. It was going to launch mass casualty assaults deep inside Israeli territory in 1 month's time. It probably would have kidnapped a vast number of people in order to procure from Israel the freeing of further jailed Palestinian terrorists, who they receive, of course, as heroes when they come back. In these circumstances, something had to be done. Now, the Israelis, you could say, well, they had look at the casualties, they're disproportionate. That means that you're saying the Israelis should suffer and sustain hundreds of dead and thousands of dead, perhaps, and thousands more maimed before they respond.
Or
maybe not even
ensure that their strikes are not impacting civilians.
Well, you can ensure it up to a point. If, for example, if Hamas is firing rockets from within a house, and they implore, and Palestinians willingly come along and inhabit the house, you don't actually have civilians there. You have non-combatants, But in international law, a military target does remain a military target, even if the side using it compromises it by the crime of perfidy. The crime of perfidy, of course, is filling it with civilians, making a civilian target out of a military target.
All right.
One has to still exercise care, but it doesn't invalidate a strike at a time. The Israelis have responded to this situation like no other army in the world. They have texted messages telling people of an impending strike, thereby losing the element of surprise. They have sent in troops on the ground when it would have been safer to strike from the air. They have phoned messages. They have dropped leaflets. Very often, I can cite you particular cases. There was one in Khan Yunis, I think, on July the 8th, for example, where a particular house was going to be targeted. The Israelis sent warning. The civilians there decided to remain, and others actually joined them because they actually believed, based on precisely the fact that Israel is reluctant to strike a target if there are civilians in the vicinity, that the Israelis may not strike at all. The Israelis didn't see the civilians coming, they struck, and a lot of people died. Totally avoidable, totally unnecessary, but this is how Hamas chooses to fight.
All right, let me bring, Yousef, you wanted to respond to some of the things that is being posited by Professor Mandel. I'm going to give you the opportunity to go ahead and do that.
Well, it's clear that your guest is a spokesperson of the Israeli army. I mean, his answers absolutely are lies. As I tell you...
You're a spokesman of Hamas, but where would name-calling
Just
Gaza?
a moment.
We are the Palestinian
gentlemen,
please. Just allow Yousef to really weigh in on some of the things that you've said. Go ahead, Yousef.
We, the Palestinians of Gaza, as I said, not all people in Gaza they support Hamas. I myself, I criticize Hamas, and I have a problem with Hamas, but I don't accept the fact to collectively punish me because Hamas has been ruling Gaza. And the main reason why Israel decided to launch this aggression in Gaza because Israel wants to sabotage the Palestinian national unity. Just tell you something. Manuel Musallam, he's a Palestinian in Palestine. He said that if the Israelis destroy your mosques, then we are going to open our churches. Israel does not differentiate between a Muslim or a Christian, and this is a fact. A Christian has been targeted. A woman died from the bombardment. And the church are now open for Muslims who are seeking shelters in Gaza. So you cannot claim that there is problems between Christians and Muslims. This is a lie, and this is really annoying, okay? So
I'm sorry you're annoyed, but I am compelled to mention the fact that the Christians have been driven out of Gaza. The terrorists, by the way, have a habit of occupying churches as well. Defacing them, I might add, into the...
You claim that Hamas has been, digging tunnels, and the reason why these tunnels were built just to overcome the Israeli siege in Gaza. As I said, people rely on these tunnels along Gaza-Egypt border to bring in badly needed medicine and medical supplies, goods, fuel, etc. And Hamas itself, they said that they are willing to accept a long-term truce, 20 years extendable truce if Israel lifts the siege. And Hamas itself, they said that they are willing to accept a Palestinian state on 1967 borders, lands occupied in 1967 with Jerusalem as its capital. So, and Israel has been using disproportionate force, attacking civilians. And Israel claims that look at the incident that took place a few days ago in the northern Gaza Strip town of Beit Hanun, when 3,000 people were seeking shelter at a United Nations school. Israel had shelled that school without any warning. If Israel claims...
Were Hamas forces at the UN's installation at Beit Hanun, yes or no?
Something wrong with your equipment. You've got the most sophisticated equipment.
There were Hamas forces there. You're not answering my question.
Between civilians and militants. You cannot just kill civilians. Israel enjoys a culture of impunity. Israel is a country above the international law. How do you expect me to revolt against Hamas when you are killing my own family? So I'm going to support the resistance in this case. This is, the whole...
So you are a supporter of Hamas. Well, that does clarify matters. I'm very glad your record is now better known to our listeners. Thank you.
To pardon you. When you kill my family, I'm not going to pardon you. I'm going, to defend my people, okay? So
the same could be said on either side, but that's not really the point. The point here is that Hamas is conducting a double war crime of endangering its own population while deliberately attempting to murder Israelis en masse. Any country is going to respond to that. You know that. I know that. The idea that you can deny it is absurd. And just to be absolutely clear, if one had to summarize it in two sentences, I would put it this way. Look, the Israelis use bunkers to shield their civilians. The Hamas use civilians to shield their weapons in bunkers. If you understand that, you understand what's happening in this conflict.
Go ahead, Yousef.
Collateral damage. You are attacking civilian population. You are killing the children playing on the beach. So something wrong with your equipment. You've got the most sophisticated weapons on earth. And I think it's important that you should reconsider, because Israel is isolated now. Also Israel enjoys...
Well, I think actually there's a great deal of greater understanding in the international community as a result of Hamas's repeated attacks, as a result of the clear fact that it's firing rockets indiscriminately to Israel, that it started the conflict, not the Israelis, with the kidnapping originally and the murder of 3 teenagers. And of course also with the discovery of tunnels built of concrete and steel imported at tremendous expense, which the European and American donors are paying for Hamas to launch terrorist attacks in Israel. This is not a government that looks after its people. I would honestly tell anyone who ever wanted to donate money to any useful cause, and unfortunately you can't do it when you're trying to help any impoverished Palestinian. The PA and the Hamas have lined terrorists' pockets. They haven't relieved Palestinian economic malaise or corruption. To the contrary, they've contributed to it. If I had $1 billion, I can tell you where I would give it. Do people listening to this program know the country in Africa of Niger? Niger has only 1 doctor for every 33,000 people. That's a good cause. That's a good cause. If you want to help people, of course, if you want to feel good that you're helping the Palestinians, but actually contribute to terrorist coffers, you can give to the PA or the Hamas. You can do that. But,
all right, gentlemen,
you're not entitled to the illusion that you're doing anything humane. That's my point.
May I bring your attention to the response of the international community? The Jamaican ambassador to the United Nations has condemned the actions of Israel. Professor Mandel, starting with you and then to Yousef, do you think the international community owes the Palestinian civilians a stronger response to Israel's actions?
Well, if put it this way, I'd rather answer it from the reverse and say that if were the international community to offer a strong response, by which presumably you would mean that Israel would have to end its counter-offensive against the terror tunnels now, you would simply be becoming an enabler of Hamas terror. Now, as a matter of morality, as a matter of conscience, I don't think that's anything that Jamaica or any other country, if it really wants to look at it, should want to be doing.
Yousef?
Well, once again, let me just reiterate that not all people in Gaza support Hamas. I myself was criticized Hamas and I faced some problems with them. But once again, you cannot collectively punish the whole population because of Hamas. You can target Hamas militants, but you are not allowed. I mean, how dare you just kill children on the beach while they're playing? How dare you attack UNRWA headquarters today? How dare you attack hospitals? How dare you attack paramedics, churches? And you can bring in all these justifications and excuses, saying that Hamas is using Palestinians as a human shield. Israel has used Palestinians in Khuzaa town in the eastern part of Khan Yunis in the southern Gaza Strip as a human shield. Israel has transformed many houses in that area into military posts, and Israel has stopped a number of ambulances and tried to arrest a number of wounded people. So what Israel is doing in Gaza is trying to push people in Gaza to blame Hamas. Of course, as I said once again, not all people in Gaza are Hamas, but at the end of the day, when you use excessive force, disproportionate force to attack civilians, how do you expect Gaza just to greet you? This is not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. So then you would want the international community to respond in a stronger way?
Well, I think the international community has to realize that without ending the prolonged Israeli military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, there will never be stability in the region. We teach the love of our homeland to our children, and I think it's important that Israel should respect international law and should implement UN resolutions and should recognize Palestinians' right to live in their own land. Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem constitutes only 20% of the total area of historic Palestine. Why the indigenous population who became refugees all over the world, they are not allowed to return back? Why any Jew from any country in the world is granted an Israeli citizenship?
Oh, that's very easy to answer. That's very easy to answer. Every refugee problem of the 20th century has not been resolved by repatriation. It has been solved by resettlement, which is A, precisely what the Palestinians refuse, and B, why they view any attempt to aid Palestinian refugee resettlement as a hostile act, because it takes away from the excuse to fight a war on Israel. Look, in 2001, in the West Bank, they burnt the Canadian Foreign Minister, John Manley, in effigy. Why? Because Canada had said we'd be happy to welcome Palestinian refugees for resettlement within the context of an Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Fatah said, Well, you can expect attacks in Montreal and Ottawa if you do that.
Bro.
That's very telling. That's not the most typical response you get to offer of humanitarian refugee relief, which tells you that a lot of people don't understand what's actually happening there. This is not about a Palestinian state. It's not about solving the plight of refugees and their millions of descendants, who, of course, could be resettled in any one of the neighboring Arab countries in which they've lived all their lives or tomorrow. It's about destroying Israel and having a pretext for continuing war about Israel. Surely I've made that plain.
Can you define the border of Israel to me? Does it include the West Bank and Gaza? What are the borders of Israel? Define it to me, please.
There are no set borders of Israel. That is to be determined by negotiation between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including the Palestinians. I've already told you, in 2000 and again in 2008, there were peace offers put on the table by the American president and by the Israeli prime minister, which have been refused without counteroffer. Refused without counteroffer in 2000 by Yasser Arafat, and in 2008 by Mahmoud Abbas. Surely that's a matter of record.
So many concessions, but we are not happy with these concessions.
Yousef, I want to ask you this because we are aware that there are many attempts at arriving at peace to settle this. Why has it been so hard for these two groups to kind of come to a peace agreement? What is the real issue why there cannot be peace?
Is this question to me?
Yes, Yousef, yes.
Well, I think, as everybody agrees, Israel is a state that came into existence on the expense of the Palestinian rights. It's what's happening in the occupied territory is a continuation to Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign. And it can see clearly that Israel does not want to see Palestinians having their own state. And let's remember, before Hamas came into existence, you had the PLO. And when the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, since 1993, we have not seen any progress regarding the peace process. I mean, it was ended in 5 years from the Oslo Accords. There was supposed to be a Palestinian state. This did not happen. Israel is buying time. Israel enjoys the culture of impunity. And this cannot go on. I mean, if you want to live with peace with the Palestinians, simply, it's just you have to recognize our right to exist. Are you willing to do so?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Israeli government's already done so. But both sides even agreed in principle to a Palestinian state, although, of course, it's not going to happen under current conditions because the Palestinians don't want a state. They won't sign an end-of-claims agreement. They've been explicit about it. Mahmoud Abbas said that, addressing the UN, no less, a couple of years ago. Look, this is quite simple. The Oslo process didn't work for one simple reason. The Palestinians are not prepared to see a peace treaty with the State of Israel as the end game. They're not prepared to have a Palestinian state living alongside the State of Israel under any border conditions. You cannot therefore have peace if one side is committed to a continuing war. That's incidentally why, for example, the Nakba celebrations the Palestinians have is not well understood. The Nakba is held every day on the day Israel came into existence in 1948. And the juxtaposition isn't accidental. We're meant to understand that Israel's creation caused the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Arabs. But the truth is, in fact, that there was no forcible displacement of Arabs. There was a war launched by the Arab states when Israel was created. The refugees are a product of a war launched by the Arab parties. And the reason for their grievance now is not because refugees were created, not because they can't be resettled because they could be, but because they want another round in which the Palestinians win. And Nakba celebration is not merely a commemoration like, for example, the Americans commemorating the loss at Pearl Harbor. It's a commemoration of something very, very different. They don't mourn the ill-conceived choice of going to war to abort Israel. They mourn only that they failed. This is, by the way, contrary to historic experience of disastrous defeat. The Germans today, for example, mourn their losses in the Second World War, but they don't laud the invasion of Poland, the attempt to subjugate Europe. They don't glorify Nazi aggression. The Japanese mourned their losses in the Second World War as well, but they don't laud their assault on Pearl Harbor. They don't praise and glorify the attempt to subjugate Southeast Asia. They don't glorify Japanese imperialism. The Palestinians, however, would like to succeed today, unlike the Germans and Japanese, at what they miserably failed to achieve then. That's the core of the problem.
No doubt that we have a weak leadership, and unfortunately, President Abbas has made so many concessions. That's why he lost the faith of the Palestinian people. Now, as I said, if you want a just solution to this problem, then the inalienable rights of the Palestinians have to be addressed. Number one, you must end your occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. and you must release all political prisoners in Israeli jail.
Which occupation is that? 98% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are living under Palestinian regimes. One Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. What occupation?
Territory, you'll practice an apartheid regime in the West Bank. You build the apartheid wall.
It appears you can now have an occupation without people being occupied.
Continue to violate our naval blockade, our Mediterranean Sea. So
the naval blockade, of course, is entirely legal. It's a blockade to prevent war material reaching an unlawful terrorist organization in Gaza. It's both under international law and under the 1994 agreement between Israel and the PLO. Which actually says, it says explicitly in Article 11, Israeli naval vessels may take any measures necessary against vessels suspected of being used for terrorist activities or for smuggling arms, ammunition, drugs, goods, or any other illegal activity. That's the law. You can't expect a blockade to end. Why would you want to blockade it? Can you expect a blockade to end when the side being blockaded has said that it will use every device to continue and fight a war to the finish until the other side no longer exists? You can't realistically expect it.
Mm-hmm. So we're running out of time. We're running out of time, gentlemen. So I'm just going to ask you first, starting with you, Yousef, and then to Professor Mandel, to give us, in your view, what is necessary to end this conflict. First with you, Yousef, and then to Professor Mandel.
I think it's necessary to recognize that Palestinians are still under Israel's military occupation since 1948. And the Palestinians, in general, they accepted a two-state solution, a state based on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The main core issues must be addressed: the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, the natural resources the Palestinians have, they must have their share, and also the recognition by the United Nations. Palestine is still an occupied territory. Gaza is still an occupied territory. Palestine, Gaza, West Bank should be one territorial unit. Palestinians in both territories must actually move. Israel is still controlling our birth registry. This means that any born baby in the occupied territories has to get the approval from the Israeli authorities. So, believe me, I have no problem with the Jewish people. I have Jewish friends. But when it comes to justice, I think it's important to address the needs of the Palestinians. We should have our own independent state. We should have a decent life. And the resistance groups were founded justify the Israeli occupation. And let's just also not forget that Israel also, attacks peaceful demonstration, throughout the West Bank, protecting the building of the apartheid wall. So we are normal people. We are not asking for too much. We are asking for our rights to be granted. That's it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Yousef. Professor Mandel, your take on what needs to be done to end the conflict?
Very, very simply, hostilities with Gaza in the long term can be ended if Hamas is decommissioned as a military organization that can launch these attacks either overland by rocket into Israel or underground and to have mass casualty assaults. You can end it, of course, like the previous ceasefires, with a premature ceasefire which keeps things pretty much in place, that essentially restores the status quo ante and gives Hamas a few benefits like importing steel and concrete, which they then use to build terrorist tunnels. But that doesn't end the conflict. As we know, that's a patchwork solution. Not going to work in the long term. What is going to occur? Hard to say. I think the Israelis on this occasion are at least pretty determined to make sure that they get the job done and remove this threat, this very serious threat to its civilian population, before running the risk of another war and also having a mass casualty assault at some time of Hamas's choosing in the future. I noticed, by the way, my discussant in this referred to Palestinians being occupied since 1948. That was a great Freudian slip because it tells you that they don't accept the existence of Israel under any borders. 1948, of course, being the year in which Arab states and the Palestinian militias refused to accept the United Nations disposition of two states in the region, an Arab state and a Jewish state, and went to war to abort it on the day that it came into existence. So we know how it can end. The only question is whether Israel gets the time and insists on doing it, or whether we incentivize Hamas terrorism and simply end things pretty much where they are, which means, of course, that we will have a flare-up in 5 months or 6 months or a year or 18 months or 2 years, and then we can reconvene and join this program and discuss exactly what we discussed today. I don't think that would be the best solution.
All right, we have to leave it there, gentlemen. Historian and professor at Melbourne University, Professor Daniel Mandel, Independent Palestinian-based journalist Yousef Al-Helou. I hope I'm pronouncing that right again. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. listeners, something tells me that the conversation surrounding this conflict will continue, and the international community will continue to look for a solution to what is escalating into a very, very serious humanitarian crisis. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're in the feedback segment. Stay with us.